I am Denise Craig. I have been a Master Gardener volunteer for about 13 years. And I have loved the program because it asks us all to continuously learn, to just keep learning. They don't tell us what we have to learn. They just say, you have to learn something. And I was surprised that it took me to insects. It was a long trek to get there. And Tracy explained some of it to you. But if you bring native plants into your yard, you're going to get a lot of wildlife. And even though I live in the country, much of the wildlife I saw every day, I had never, ever seen before in my life. When we talk about 9 species of wasp on that solidago, I didn't know there were 9 species of wasp. You just can't understand. I came to it so naively and so unaware. Now I've actually now, this thing about the bees, I only learned this about the bees within the last 2 years. There were things about the bees I did not know and did not really think about, but some new research has indicated to the entomologists that they need backyard gardeners to take action now. And they mean this spring, because it turns out there are bees that need our help now. They're very vulnerable to extinction, and we can save that. We can save the plants they need, and we can save those bees. Now, what I'm showing you now is I want you to understand that I did not come to gardening as a really good gardener. I would have to say I am still not a really good gardener. My temperament is not suited. I've seen what real gardeners can do, and they create. They're disciplined and different than me. But I want you to see that even a gardener like me, I can make a difference in the lives of those animals. Now, what you've got there, I decided at some point, about several years before this picture was taken, that I needed to grow milkweed, and I needed to have a butterfly garden on the west end of my house, where not even people who came up the drive would see it. And people had made me frightened about planting milkweed. So I went to the barn and got a dresser, an old wooden dresser, laid it on its back and put it out there. And all that milkweed was put into that dresser. And of course, it was never a problem. It's never been a problem. Years later now, I do have common milkweed, and everyone warned me about that. And it is spreading, but it's incredibly beautiful. And if you don't want it in one place, you just pull those roots out, and it won't grow there because it has other opportunities. Anyway, I wanted you to see this startup butterfly garden. And at the very end, you'll see what I have at the end. It's taken years to get the plants I need. What you'll be asking is, why would we garden for bees? And we'll do it for selfish reasons, of course. And some of them are economic reasons. And a lot of them have to do with the honeybee. The honeybee added $19 billion to our agricultural economy. And that wasn't recently. That data might be 5 or 6 years old. Honeybees have been in some trouble recently, in decline, with disease and virus and mites and theft. People steal hives. That's amazing. And but they are supported constantly by a beekeeper who takes care of their home, makes certain they have food on the table, makes certain they have water, and makes certain all the temperatures are correct for them. And so we don't, while we need the services of honeybees, we don't have anything to do with them. Our garden's about saving our native bees. Beekeeping itself is kind of a risky business. Try this. Now, there are other personal reasons why you'd want to garden for the bees. And that's, you've heard these. Our food, 1 out of every 3 bites of food has required pollination. The bees are the best pollinators, so pollination probably by bees. But what we didn't know, and when I started reading about bees, I just have all kinds of things I did not know, is that what really matters is that bees pollinate the fruits and vegetables that are a little bit difficult to pollinate. And those fruits and vegetables give us our nutrients. Now, one of the pieces of data that stunned me is that 98% of the vitamin C we get comes from pollinated plants, and plants pollinated by bees. I want to show you this picture because this is I live in the country and nobody sees my place, and I don't have a lawn. I have what I call a fire break. So I just do what I want out there. And I do a lot of experiments, but one of the things I wanted was more native plants. And one way you can get more is by creating tree islands, where you have to plant trees and you have to have space. And I got trees and I have space. So this is one of the first ones I actually planted particularly. It's got a cherry tree in it, and I usually don't get the cherries. The birds do, whatever. I didn't care about that. But I do have leaves. It's the prunus species, and that's an extremely good species for growing caterpillars, which is a very good thing for gardeners to do. In front of it is, I'd always wanted that tiger eye sumac. So that is one of my first tree islands, and you're going to see it in many forms as we go on. What we're going to discuss today is, of course, the native bees. And I remember I didn't much pay attention to them. Even when I had my native plants and I began to see all the insects, I was sort of, look at all these little bitty black and white bees. What are these? What the heck is a little tiny black and white bee? Many of them about a half an inch, and then, of course, some smaller. When you decide to accept this mission, which is to grow bees and love them and care for them, you will have to create habitat for bees and habitat for native bees. Flowers will provide nectar to your bees. That's their primary food. The adult bee needs nectar. But more than nectar, they must have pollen in order to reproduce. And this was something I just didn't understand. Their young feed on a mixture of pollen and nectar. And the female bee puts that little, it's called bee bread. She mixes up a little mix of nectar and pollen, puts it on the egg that she's laid inside a tubular tunnel. And I'll be talking more about those. But what we didn't know, and this is the stuff I only learned this about 8 months ago, and I've just been startled. Again, my ignorance is abysmal. Not all pollen is alike. Now, I just didn't, of course that makes sense, but I didn't think about it like that. Well, it turns out there are these things called specialist bees. They've evolved for eons in certain regions. Now, Kansas is in the Great Plains region, and actually the Southern Great Plains, but the science hasn't progressed far enough to help gardeners as much as we would like. What we know is that specialist bees require special plants that carry special pollen, that their babies are only able to eat that special pollen. So one of the things I'm doing this spring, I have grown from seed several varieties of sunflower, because what the entomologists are telling us is that the sunflower, our native sunflowers, support 89 specialist bees. Now, they don't know which bee, they don't know which sunflower species. So I'm planting as many species as I can to support as many specialist bees as I can. I've got this picture here. It shows you a syrphid fly. Flies are really good pollinators, and that fly mimics a bee. It's probably protective for it. And it drinks nectar. That's an adult fly. It's not stinging anything. It drinks nectar. But what I wanted you to know is that when that female lays her eggs, they hatch into larvae that eat aphids. Aphids, hundreds a day. And so if you see that funny little thing that looks like a bee, but is kind of weird, has a flat abdomen, don't squash it. We're going to be talking about decisions you make. Do not ever squash a syrphid fly. It is harmless, and its babies kill aphids. What more could you ask? Now, which bees am I going to be talking about? The native bees. There are 4,000 species of native bees in the United States. And it's kind of important for you to understand that all bees are not alike. This sentence, again, stunned me. Would you call a grizzly bear a seal? We would not do that. That's because we can see the features of each and we're able to distinguish them. But that little top bee is on a flax flower, and that's a metallic green sweat bee. I can see that. I said, I know that. That's a metallic green sweat bee. I got this. It turns out there's something like 39 species of metallic green sweat bee. There's something like almost 300 species of sweat bees. So in fact, I don't have this. I don't know what that bee is, but I do know that I can take care of it by providing it flowers. Mostly we won't be able to ID them. But again, this is the purple flower there is New England aster. It's one of my very favorite flowers on my very favorite shrub, which is a pain in the neck to get to be beautiful. I don't garden for beauty. I garden for bugs. So what you have to do is you have to cut it back twice in the summer. At least I do at least once about July 4th. Now on that aster is a little black and white bee. Once you plant natives, you're going to have little black and white bees. But this one, I knew in a heartbeat what it was. There's a species of bee called leaf cutter, and the leaf cutter bee carries its pollen on its abdomen. So I'm looking out at a flower and I see a little bee that has pollen on its abdomen. I just practically did cartwheels. It was so exciting. I knew I had a leaf cutter. And by the way, there are like, I don't know, 250 species of leaf cutter bees. So I really didn't have it, but I got in the neighborhood. Now, how are you going to create bee habitat in your garden? The first thing I want you to do is be very knowledgeable about bees. The more I read about them, again, I don't know how to say this. I don't know if all of you have read about bees. It's so important. It's a magnificent animal. That's what it is. It's an animal that, first of all, it serves our needs beautifully, but it's also magnificent in itself. So I wanted to tell you what a bee's adult life cycle is like. First of all, of those 4,000 native bees, 90% of them are solitaries, which means that a female bee creates her own tunnel, builds her own nests, lays her own eggs, and she does that for the 20 days that she has an adult life. This would be a female mason bee, especially. A female mason bee has 20 days from her hatching to lay. She might have 10 to 13 eggs, and she might be able to create 10 to 13 cells that will then, she will die, and they will be inside a tunnel, well protected, and they will be first the egg, and then the larvae, and then they will be a pupa, and they will hatch again in the spring, and an adult female mason bee will come out. This is, by the way, it's so cunning. Nature is so cunning. These tunneling bees, they lay the female eggs down at the bottom of the tunnel because of predators. And they put the male bees at the top of the tunnels, where the predator is more likely to be successful in eating one of those delicious bee larvae. But it also serves another function. Those male bees hatch first. They come out of that tunnel. Remember, there are about 12 bees in that tunnel at most. And they'll come out and they will go after nectar, and they'll hang around because they're waiting for the female bees, and they want to mate with those bees. And that's what happens at first. Those females come out of those nests and they're mated with. The male goes off then and dies. His work is done, but she now has 20 days that are an extraordinary labor. So I've already mentioned most of them are solitary. She has 20 days to save her species by laying her 10 eggs. Now, here's what she has to do. She's a mason bee, so she creates small cells inside these tubular tunnels, and she seals her cells with mud. So she has to make, for this, the first cell she makes, she lays her egg, she supplies it with pollen, and she seals it with mud. Well, the first thing you need to know is that she had to make 10 trips to her mud source in order to get enough to seal this teeny tiny cell. Now, that's not all she does. She has, in order to get enough pollen for that single egg, she's had to make at least 15 trips, possibly as many as 35 trips to her flowers, the nectar and pollen source. Now, that's just not enough. She isn't making 15 trips to flowers. She's making 15 trips And on each trip, she's visiting 75 flowers because she needs that much pollen to create that food for the baby that's going to live through the winter. So she has visited probably 8,000, as few as 8,000 flowers in her 20 days, and as many as 35,000 flowers in her 20 days. And then what she's done is she's had 7 to 13 eggs, and then she dies. That's her 21-day life. I just think we have to admire them. And busy as a bee, I had no idea. I had no idea how magnificent these animals are. And now I want to show you, this is again my New England aster. I can't recommend it enough. It won't be the most beautiful plant you have, but in October, it will be covered with these blossoms. And it will also, late October, it will have lots of monarch butterflies. They must have nectar. They still have 1,000 miles to go to get to their mountains in Mexico, and they need that nectar. And this New England aster is still providing nectar. And that's what the other asters are out there and they've got flowers, and I hope they're providing nectar. I've had trouble growing them in my wilds. This bee is a little black and white bee, and it's a digger bee. And this, I know there are something like 400 species of digger bees, but notice his hind legs. He carries pollen on his hind legs like that. And so I thought, oh, wow, now I've got a digger bee. I didn't realize at the time that I had one of 400 species of digger bees. These bees nest in tunnels in the ground. That would be 70% of these bees nest in tunnels in the ground of our native bees. That means you need to leave bare ground. You need to have bare ground that has no foot traffic, that has no toddler walking into it, that doesn't get lawn mowed, that is maybe in the warm sun and warms up early in the morning, and is maybe soft enough so that a tiny bee can dig a tunnel. And they will aggregate sometimes, some species. And that means you might, say behind your garage, you've got such an excellent spot. You might go back there and see 15, they look like little anthills, only they got these taller mounds. And you say, what are these? Well, it's an aggregate of bees that have tunneled behind your garage. Now, what they do is they don't bother each other. They're solitary. They have their own life to lead, and they do that, but they're using the same habitat. It turns out that's excellent habitat for a bee that needs to tunnel into the ground, and they're willing to share it because, as you know, the mason bee only gets to lay 13 eggs. She's not taking up that hole behind the garage area. Anyway, I want you to admire them, and the more you learn about them, you will admire them. I'm not able to see the top of these, but I think I know what I'm supposed to be saying. Can we domesticate native bees? Well, no, that's a problem that the agricultural industry is trying to figure out. If the honeybee gets into very serious problems, we remember that before the honeybee got here from Europe, it was the only thing pollinating plants on the Western continents. The agricultural industry is they're experimenting all the time to figure out how they can use these native bees. Well, first of all, they use the bumblebee. The bumblebee is manageable, not domesticatable, but manageable in greenhouses. And the bumblebee is essential to pollinate tomato plants, for example. They have to be buzz pollinated, and it takes a big bee to do that, and the honeybee cannot do it. So in the west of the Rockies, they manage bumblebees in the same way they do in the east. The eastern bumblebee is managed also in greenhouses, but something happened in the west. Human management bungled this task, and somehow funguses or something got into the bumblebee nests, and it spread apparently throughout the West. And so they failed to survive our human efforts at management. Now you still have the eastern bumblebee still pollinating tomatoes in greenhouses on the east of the Rockies. And I have a picture of one. This is an actual eastern bumblebee. And it's on my oh, I cannot remember that word when I need it. It's a native plant that's about 5 feet tall and it has these beautiful flowers. It's flowering right now in the spring and it will come to me. But they're working in greenhouses in the east, and the eastern beekeepers in those greenhouses will not give them to beekeepers on the West Coast. They say, no, you killed the western bumblebee. It's dangerous to move any species, any native species away from their habitat. And he said, and you proved yourselves to be a little inadequate for the task. So they're not sharing the eastern bumblebee. I don't know how they're pollinating tomato plants in the West. Luckily, I have an IT guy here. Okay, good. Now we're back to this. That says, I hope you can see it. It says, what about bobs? That means the blue orchard bee, which is a mason bee. Remember, one of the almost 200 species of mason bee, but it's one that orchardists use. It pollinates orchards, and it's an efficient, excellent pollinator, far better than any honeybee ever could be. They rarely sting. They're quite easy for even a novice to raise. But the problem is the numbers of honeybees we use, and that we haven't learned how to get those kinds of numbers yet in the mason bee, but they're working on it. There is one grower in the United States who has grown and has up for sale 1 million bobs, blue orchard bees. That somebody, an enterprising, probably small farmer with orchards, could take those million bees and set it up so that he could continue to grow bees, or she could continue to grow bees, and use them to, without buying anything, they would be able to pollinate their own crops, their strawberry plants, their squash plants, their the orchards. This particular bee is an orchard bee. Now, to pollinate an acre of an apple orchard, 1 acre, honeybee hives have about 20,000 bees in them, and it would require 1 to 2 hives. Let's just say 20,000 bees, honeybees, to pollinate 1 acre of apple trees. You would need 250 mason bee females to pollinate that same acre. Now, this is why it seems so attractive. You can grow in your backyard 250 mason bees. That's doable. And if you have an acre of apple trees, you might think about it. Now, you want to know why do they, it still isn't going to solve the problems, because the honeybees, we can't sell 1 million. We must have 1 billion to sell to replace that honeybee population. And the Washington State apple crop needs a lot of bees. It would need 41 million of blue orchard bee females. And that's the small number, maybe up to over 100 million. But I want to show you why they pollinate so well. This is a rose of Sharon, and I didn't really ever much see insects go in or out at any time. But in the fall, I saw a bee go into this particular flower. And therefore, I knew what it was when it came out. But otherwise, I would not. It was unrecognizable. It was covered with pollen. It was shedding pollen. It dripped pollen when it came out of that flower. That's what mason bees do every time they pollinate a flower. They kind of crash land and slide into the pollen. And then there's, they've blown pollen this way and sprinkled it up that way. It's like they did one of those 12-year-old boy dives into a pool of water. That's what they're doing, and which is why they're so efficient at pollinating. This is a honeybee. And I would not have been able to tell that. I wonder if she knew that was going to happen to herself. I'm asking the same question. How are we going to garden for these bees? And remember, you may have to start small. I don't know how much you do already garden, but if you have to start small, you start with the flowers. You want to attract them to your yard, your backyard, to that small, you may just start a small area, and you must have flowers. Enormous numbers of flowers of the same species, because they need to see them. And that there's more to this than what I'm telling you. But when I've been reading these books lately, they say, make certain, let's say I told you I was trying different sunflowers. Let's say, make certain that the same species. I've got the Hopi sunflower, which comes from the Southwest, and I wanted to try that because it's an heirloom. And I thought, who knows what specialist bee might like the Hopi sunflower. They want me to plant that in an area that is at least 4 square feet. So I'll need multiple Hopi sunflower plants to eventually end up with a giant, huge grouping of those sunflowers. They want us, and when I say they, I mean the entomologists and the ecologists. They want us to create swaths of flowers, huge swaths, all blooming at the same time. So you'll have a minimum of 3 species of flowers in 4 square foot huge groupings for each season of your summer, for the spring, for the summer, and the fall. And that will be the minimum that might attract bees to this first-time garden. Now, you know that all the bees need pollen to reproduce, and all of them, the adults need nectar. That's their energy supply. They all have to have that juice, those bees. But this slide is to remind you that there is nectar and there is pollen on annual flowers. Some non-native plants are wonderful sources of nectar and pollen. The one on the left, zinnias, you can just buy a packet of seeds and toss it in your garden, and then you'll have a swath of zinnias, and that's not expensive. Remember, that's $2 and you get a 4-foot square of zinnias. And that's a lot of nectar and pollen. The trouble is you'll need to do it again in about 4 weeks because you want them blooming. You need continuous blooming in your garden. So if those zinnias wear out, you want other zinnias coming on, or sunflowers, or gaillardia, some huge swath of flowers that will be in bloom so that there's a lot of nectar all the time and a lot of pollen all the time. Now, this Harlequin marigold is one of my favorite heirlooms, and I have had trouble finding the seed, but it makes almost a little shrubby plant. It's not a little cute cluster, of flowers. It's this other thing, and it attracts lots and lots of butterflies in the fall, and this one was in my vegetable garden. But it can provide nectar to all of the bees, and it can provide pollen to most of the bees, but not to the specialist bees. These alien plants did not evolve in South Central Kansas, and they did not evolve with one of our specialist bees. So we have 170 native bees. We have 170 specialist bees in Kansas. That is more than in any state except Texas. And Texas has close to 500 specialist bees. But 43% of our native bees are specialists. So I want you to know that, I think I said that data wrong. I'm sorry. It's 170 native bees, and 43% of them are specialists, and they're in Kansas, and they need our care, and in South Central Kansas. Now, how to garden for those specialist bees? These are words I'd only learned in the last year. I only learned this stuff. Specialist bees, I kept reading that. I said, what are you talking about? That's crazy. But I said, who needs a host plant? Only monarchs need host plants. Butterflies, the monarch caterpillar has to have milkweed. See, I was a little bit of a know-it-all, and I knew nothing about specialist bees. Specialist bees must have host plants, and that host plant produces the pollen that they evolved with, the only pollen that their larvae can eat. And so they have host plants that are now considered keystone plants also. Oh, and that's a new word. I didn't know the keystone word, but you know about that Roman arch. Without the keystone, the arch falls. Without the wolf in Yellowstone, they were losing the rivers because the willows were taking them over, because the wolf is killing the elk. So they are not overgrazing the rivers. So they're restoring the habitat in Yellowstone because they introduced a keystone animal, the wolf. I'm certain many of you know more about that than I do. Now, in the central United States, there are 1,800 species of native bees, and 600, that about 30% of them, need specialist plants. And that means they need native plants, native to the central United States. Now, these scientists haven't done enough for us yet, and I know they must be working on it. We want to know what Wisconsin's in the central United States. They aren't growing the same plants we are in Kansas. So what we have to do is we kind of, okay, the Central Great Plains is the region. Our specialist bees in South Central Kansas will have evolved with the plants that are in similar ecosystems as South Central Kansas. Now, what they can tell us, they can't tell us the species of sunflower, but they can tell us sunflowers, plant sunflowers, and you can grow those from seed. And I am growing this year 3 species from seed. I've never grown things from seed, but the entomologist frightened me. I felt like I had to save the planet by growing these plants. They love asters. Asters are vital, and the sunflower. Part of the reason for their vitality, why they're so vital, is because they bloom late in the fall. Goldenrod is a late fall bloomer, and that's why it's vital. And goldenrod, by the way, supports butterflies, supports caterpillars, and supports lots of specialist bees. The willow, and we don't mean by willow, the weeping willow. Anything that came from another continent, anything that came from another part of the United States will not help a specialist bee. It has to be a willow that grew up in South Central Kansas or something like that. Now I have at my pond a native willow. It's a black, I think it's a form of peach leaf willow, but it's called a black willow. That is a native, and it is ugly, and it falls apart, and they don't have long lives. But I'm keeping that dude out there because it does have the pollen that some specialist bee might need. And I'm going to try to take better care, and I'm going to try to get more of them. Primroses, false indigo, and you have these in your garden already. Black-eyed Susan. I always grow lots of black-eyed Susan, and I bought lots of seed packets because those dudes love to start from seed. And I'm going to cluster them in just giant areas. And I'm already imagining the sunflowers behind the black-eyed Susan, the Gaillardia in front of that. It's just going to be a huge whiz of a garden if I can get all those little seedlings to grow. And coneflowers. I read some research done in Northeast Kansas. There are remnant native areas in the parks in Northeast Kansas, the city parks in Northeast Kansas. And in those remnant areas, they've done a study of the specialist bees. They found so many specialist bees in these small areas that had never been developed. No corn had ever been planted there. Nobody had ever plowed it. Nobody had ever done anything to it but let it be native. And they found all these specialist species. And one of them lived only on the pale purple coneflower. I've never even grown a pale purple coneflower. So now I'm adding to my coneflower. They grow from seed. They're not quite so easy to grow as a sunflower. Or at least not for me. But that's what I want you to understand. You can go right now. It's not too late to start plants from seed, and you can get huge numbers of plants in flower for specialist bees, and you might not have known about them until tonight. Now, again, how are we going to garden for bees? You're going to use native plants. There's a lot of research on this. This isn't just coming out of the top of my head. The bees are 4 times more likely to go to native flowers. It doesn't matter who's in flower or what. If it's a native plant, bees will go to that native plant. Culver's root, that's what that flower is. And it's a native plant. It's a tall one. Look how beautiful it is. But it's going to have to be at the back of your border or in the center. I have it with cup plant and I have it with compass plant because these are tall plants, but they attract native animals. I have a list here of the Xerces Society. I'm sorry, I do not know how to say that. Has made lists of the native plants native flowers that we could use in our gardens. And I believe you're probably using them all anyway. Hyssop, aster, I mentioned, Rudbeckia, Monarda, particularly Monarda fistulosa. Now, of course, other Monardas will work, but they're trying to get us to go back to the species plant to get us closer to the pollen that those specialists might want. I better tell you right now, it doesn't matter to the other bees if you are growing Monarda for a specialist bee. They'll chomp down on that pollen and they'll drink that nectar just fine. Anything you do for a specialist bee is good for any bee. Gaillardia, I've never been able to grow Gaillardia, but I germinated an entire packet of seeds. I'm extremely proud of myself for doing that. They still haven't made it to the garden, but they germinated nicely. Like Coreopsis, I germinated 2 packets of different Coreopsis. There's some doubt whether some of those are going to make it. Solidago you need to have because it supports so many animals. Ironweed is not invasive at all. It's a wonderful plant and it takes its time growing and it makes a beautiful flower that these animals love. Joe Pye, everybody says, oh, you can have some Joe Pye from me. I can't grow a Joe Pye. I bring your starts home and I can't get it to grow. But I can grow purple prairie clover and they love that. And I can grow from seeds milkweed. As a matter of fact, I do winter sowing and I have at home right now 15 small swamp milkweed seedlings that I started about the time of the Super Bowl. I put them in a jug, greenhouse kind of thing, and some moist soil and taped the lid on it and left them alone. And they have germinated beautifully. Now, the Xerces, you can see, I don't know how to say that word, I'm sorry. The Xerces recommendations, there are more of them, and they are still flowers you probably already have in your garden. But here's something we did not know. Just a year ago, I was giving a speech saying, what they've done, new research says, you only need 30% of the plant biomass in your yard to be native leaves. And it will still support native animals. And they had done research on chickadees and chickadee nesting and had discovered that if you had at least 30% native plants, the biomass, chickadees could not only nest, they could thrive. They could start a second nest and their young from the first nest would help them grow the second nest. So they were actually going to grow in population at 30%. But everything I'm reading recently says, oh, it should be 50%, 70%. The entomologists they're not giving ground on this. They actually know the word extinction and they believe in it and they want us to be scared too. Cleome, rattlesnake master, is a nice plant. Salvia, sneezeweed, spiderwort. I can actually, spiderwort does pretty well with me. It kind of surprises because it's so pretty. The native geranium, baptisia, lead plant, red buds. I can grow red, well, anybody can grow a red bud, I guess. And then I did plant serviceberry. I'm quite proud of that because I want you to know that these understory trees are covered with blossoms. Shrubs are covered with blossoms that flower and also might support specialist bees. Oh, and this is a sunflower called the Maximilian sunflower. It's one of my favorites. If you look at that blossom, I think it's extraordinary. I think it's the most beautiful sunflower blossom of all. Now, how again are we going to garden for bees? Well, we have to give them homes. And that in your garden is complex habitat. If you create habitat that is complicated, they will find homes. They can have homes. And I actually have, my sister said, she edits me. She said, you don't need to define habitat or homes. I said, I think I do. It's pesticide free. It's a place for them to live. It's shelter from storms, cover from predators. It's nest sites for those little baby eggs. And it's sources of food and water. They have to have all that. Now, I want you to see this lower picture is a primrose. and it was naturalizing at my house. And it created giant swaths in this low area that was actually kind of a drainage area around my place. And it was very exciting to me. And then the floods came and I think it killed it all. But they made these beautiful naturalized sites of those pink flowers. And that's the size of the flowering bed we need to think about. I need to have another group of flowering plants alongside that are also blooming in the early spring. Now, the other, I have to confess something. The other picture is I used to go to the Dick Arboretum or go anywhere and buy, I wanted to try every possible native plant. Number one, would it grow for me? Because I told you, I'm not the best, I'm not a disciplined gardener. So my native plants have to be really tough. So this is full of native plants. It's got that Maximilian sunflower. It's got the obedient plant, which I love. It's got rudbeckia. It's got, let's see, can I see anything else down there? I'm not seeing anything right away, but there are a lot of flowers there, but it's not the way they want me to grow it is I should have that entire area be a single species because that's good for the bees. What I've done will provide nectar and pollen, but it doesn't in any way make their lives better. Now, native bees forage in flowers like those I have, but only in flowers close to their nests. They cannot, I want you to imagine a suburban neighborhood and a small one, not the ones that are like mansion yards, just a kind of normal suburban neighborhood. And imagine one neighbor on the left and one neighbor on the right, maybe a little more to left and right, but so 3 houses in their gardens. That's about how far a native bee will forage. It will look, if you've got flowers, it's going to come, but it must have a nest within that 3-house environment so that it can take food to its babies. They have to nest close to the flower source. Thank you. My IT person is helpful. Now, we want this habitat, and think about your whole yard. I know that if you're starting these gardens, just think small. It's a lot of work, and thinking small is a perfect way to go. And imagine, do you have a corner in the back of your backyard that you could use? And do you have that area behind the garage I mentioned that might have soil for those little soil nesting bees? So you can start quite small, but remember, you have a whole landscape, you have a whole property, and you have a whole lawn. So you can begin thinking about things. How can you create habitat for bees everywhere on your place? You won't do it in the first summer, but kind of have in the back of your mind, how will I expand this next summer? Remember, the entomologists are prodding us to do that. They're very serious. Now, we know that flowering plants are necessary because they provide food. You're going to attract them to your property with food. And again, you must have 12 to 20 species of each flowering plant. Specimens, I should say, specimens of each flowering species that you choose. That's how you're going to get that 4-foot swath of plants with lots and lots of specimens of each species. And you'll put them in huge groupings. And your goal is, and I have something here, it's not 3 groupings of flowers, but this is fall. This is fall on the west side of my house, kind of close to my butterfly garden, but not really. Those are fireworks solidago. That's where I saw 9 different wasps that I had I'd seen a mud dauber before, but most of them I'd never seen before. They love that small flower on the solidago. And for you and your worries about stinging, if a wasp or a bee is on nectar, if they are nectaring, they are docile. I mean, I stick my nose in my camera right up at them. They ignore me. They're busy. They're dining. Thank you very much. Now you get into their nest and the story is different. You're going to be in trouble. But this is not their nest. This is their restaurant. And I've got back there in the back, I just love morning glories. It's from my mom, I know, but the bumblebees love them just fine, and they flower at the same time, and I let them climb over my asparagus. They're now making ferns, and then they kind of started growing into my solidago, and I actually thought it was pretty. I still think it's pretty. It's kind of like a vignette of flowers, and I've never done that before. So I'm very proud of that shot with my pretty flowers, but there are only 2 species flowering it, but it is a fall group. Now the goal, if you're using all these species and all of these specimens of flowering plants, is to have continuous bloom. These animals have to have food in the early spring. They have to have it in the late spring, in summer, in the heat of summer. They have to have it in the fall, and they have to have it in the coldest part of the fall. Every time, flowering plants, that's what's going to save them. Now, I have found in Kansas that early spring set of flowers has been really tough to produce. And sometimes all I've had, it's been cold and miserable and wet for several springs, it seems. And I looked out one spring, and I have a meadow that was full of henbed. And I have to tell you, I was delighted, because if we have a monarch butterfly migrating north from Mexico, and Kansas is a vital state in their migration, and she must have nectar. She must have milkweed also. I had no milkweed showing, none, but I did have nectar because I had a field full of henbed. So I find early spring hardest to have those blooms in huge abundance. But what you're going to get is, because you're doing different species, you're going to get different bloom times. You're going to get different plant choices. You're going to get different sizes and shapes and structures and stem widths and trunks and branches. Don't forget shrubs and vines and ground covers and understory trees. You want to have all of that variety, because that is going to create complex habitat. And then, of course, always increase the use of native plants from here's another word, ecoregion. The ecoregion, which they're calling the Great Plains region for those specialist bees. Now, I've said bees need nectar, pollen, and shelter. And I think probably I've just got more of these kinds of things. I've got two quick things. On this time, you can see in the back, in the front is a little green metallic sweat bee, but in the back is a bee assassin. Yes, a bee assassin. It's a true bug. Its job is to sit on flowers and wait for bees to come along and kill them. Now, before you panic completely, it's really important you understand the purpose. You have a complicated habitat, many different kinds of plants. The goal is to attract many different kinds of insects. And you will, if it gets complex enough, you will have created a habitat that sort of self-organizes. You will have not hundreds, but thousands of interactions going on each day between plants and plants, bugs and plants, predators and bees. You'll have a lot of stuff going on in that little garden of yours that you cannot control. And it is pure hubris to imagine that any human can control it. So what I want you to think about when we see the bee assassin, I don't like it. I mean, I don't like it. I've got this baby little green bee coming in, and that's worrisome. But if you can feed a population of assassin beetles, that means that you have lots of bees. You have created a rich habitat that is growing lots and lots of bees, because you are supporting one of the top predators on bees. And that's what you have to think about. You say, yeah, he's going to kill a bee, and that's his job, is to kill bees. But he can live in my garden because I have so many bees. That's what a complex habitat is. That's what an ecosystem is. Thousands of interactions that have nothing to do with us. So don't think that we're in charge. We can't manage those interactions. Oh, over here is someone's insect hotel. They were catering to the 30% of the bees that are wood tunnelers. This is almost all entirely blocks of wood, logs, stems, and that's 30% of the native bees. Now, how are you going to find space for your native plants? I've already told you my secret. I've reduced lawn. I create tree islands. But look what this homeowner did. And by the way, I admire this. This was a lot of work. He's introduced a huge amount of shrubbery and flowers all over a giant lawn. And I can promise you that was expensive. And its upkeep is expensive. But doesn't make me, it still makes, I love it anyway. But what we can do if we reduce lawn is that we change what is called the monoculture that is the lawn in the United States. The United States has approximately 30 to 40 million acres of homeowners' lawns. Now, that's more undeveloped land than in any other place. There is no other place where we can manage land of that quantity. 30 million acres is in our control. We own it. We own this acre or that half acre or this quarter acre or just, I suppose, just this patio. But it's ours and we can be a steward for that piece of land. And we can add flowering plants that are native to the Great Plains. And if you can't, if you're already caught up with creating that corner in your backyard, then you might not be able to do much more. I actually went out and bought Dutch white clover, which is not native, but which it works really well in overseeding lawns. It provides nutrients like nitrogen to the grass that's growing there, can reduce the amount of fertilizer you need, but it also has little white flowers and they cover that thing and they're not mowed. They're so short, they don't get mowed. And that means they attract bees and they feed bees. I haven't planted mine yet. It scares me to just throw seed out. I'm afraid I'll waste it. And I know I probably will. Now, bees, again, they do lay eggs and they provision their nest with the pollen and nectar, and you have to make that available. And I said, you have to use your whole yard. And right here, I'm talking about the other 70% of native bees. This is hard to stretch your mind around. They need access to soil. They dig tunnels into the ground. And these are, and I want you to remember the mason bee. This isn't the biggest tunnel in the world. And remember, she's doing a stem or in wood. So she's that other 30%. But they dig tunnels and they don't lay many more eggs than does the mason bee. And they do it all by themselves. 90% are solitary. The bumblebee is not. It's a social animal. And that's why they have been able to manage it in greenhouses. The female bumblebee overwinters in, like I have these grasses out to one end of my house, and the bumblebee might be overwintering in the middle of a center of that grass because it's dense and it's protected from predators and the elements and protected from rain. By the way, there's a giant log. If I get a tree fall, I save those logs because I'm thinking about not the ground nesters, but those wood nesters, and they will eventually riddle that log completely. And you'll see little black and white bees around it. And that's what they're doing. They're nesting in that material. And the bumblebee, and then the ground nesters though, I want you to look in front of that. I don't have a pointer, but in front of that big log that's laying there, it was bare ground. I'd had some construction. They left some sand there. We kind of spread it around. So for a couple years, it was a sandy, loamy, no things growing area. And those soil tunneling bees loved it. It was just damp enough and shady enough that they weren't in, the soil was compacted enough that they could use it. I didn't mow it. I didn't do anything. And it was really neat to see the ground would be alive with little individual black and white bees going in and out of different apartment openings. That's using your whole lawn. What else can we do? We can create artificial nests. And number one, you can drill holes in wooden blocks. A lot of you already are doing that. You can bundle stems, bamboo stems, and you can see in this one at the top right, they must have roofs to keep the water out of there. But you can see that somebody with their grandkids could easily put a lot of little sticks in there and put closed ends at the other end of that thing so predators can't get to that end. And with bricks and boards and logs and your drill motor, you could drill holes. Now, the pile of logs is what I did. I just had a pile. I have a lot of dead wood around my place, and I just gather it up sometimes, and I just made a place. Now, it may or may not have bees in it. It may or may not have mice in it. I do not control the population of that particular structure. Down in the right is that lawn. All these native insects and native bees need messy lawns. All of those stems that were left standing after the summer season could contain a bee like our mason bee. And that brings me to a story that will be important to you, or it might be. I've always loved bearded iris and I love daylilies, but it was pretty clear to me as I got on the native plant trail that they were kind of a luxury, and they were not necessarily supporting wildlife in the United States. And so I had to say, but I have the right to love certain kinds of beauty, and that's true for all of us. But one day I was walking out where I had made for years, had these iris growing and daylilies, and I saw a little odd black hole in an iris stem, about 20 inches, 18 to 20 inches above the ground. And while I watched, a little black and white bee came out and then went back in. So my iris are saved. They provide stems, pithy stems, for our wood tunnel nesters. And that means my iris and daylilies are in. They're providing shelter. Here are some more of those little things that you make at home. Oh, that slide got in there twice, sorry. But the one below is the one that interested me. Notice that this homeowner put wire around the front of that because the predators, a woodpecker in the wintertime would see those little holes drilled in the wood and see those little, well, they would find the larvae in the tips of those little straw-like sticks or hollow bamboo, and they would peck out and kill those larvae as far as they could reach into that structure. So this homeowner put wire across it so they can't get in there very well. And I just love that one. All right. And these are the numbers you remember. 30% are wood or stem nesters, 70% are ground nesters, 90% are solitary. Tidy yards are bad for bees, and they natives nest very close to where they forage for nectar and pollen. Now, what else do you have to do? You have to be very knowledgeable about plants. You know that whole thing about right plant, right place. And you're also going to add native plants every time you get a chance. You don't have to rip out what you've got. That would be, no, we don't want you ripping out beautiful plants. But if something dies, try to find a native plant that will serve the same function. And that way you can slip a new native plant in, and it will serve you and your garden and your ideas of beauty well. And then if you really can, find those keystone plants. And there are two types. There's the keystone plant that supports the most caterpillars. Caterpillars make food for the whole food web. The base of the food web are the caterpillars on plants. And so any of those plants that support lots of caterpillars, think of them as feeding all the other wildlife, because they are. And then the other kind we learned with the specialist bees is the specialist keystone plant, like the monarch's milkweed, or like the specialist bees, solidago or sunflower. These plants are saving probably the plant, maybe the plant, but certainly the bee from extinction. By the way, this is a golden Alexander. I've never grown it. I've never heard about it before. And it does, I have learned, it does spread. That's little teeny tiny flowers that are going to attract teeny tiny insects and teeny tiny flies and teeny tiny parasitoids. And you really want those tiny flowers. But it's also, it reseeds itself. So I am now pretty merciless when they're starting to form seeds. I cut the seed pods off. I've got lots of golden Alexander. And here, what are some keystone species? Well, I want to give you an example. But first of all, the sunflower is a keystone for caterpillars, and it is a keystone for bees. In the upper right corner of this slide is the Malus species, and it's the crabapple tree. And I want you to notice in the list to the left that the crabapple the number behind the crabapple is 308. That means 308 different species of moth or butterfly their caterpillars can eat the leaves of the crabapple. That's really important. That means that a lot of life can be on that tree that you won't even see. But the birds will find those worms and they will feed those worms to their babies. 96% of all terrestrial birds have to have insects to feed their young, and they prefer caterpillars. Those little baby birds don't like the sticky legs of a cricket. They like the soft fat and juices of a caterpillar. On the left is a snout butterfly, and it's on a solidago. And the solidago is a wonderful keystone supporting all kinds of butterflies and also supporting all kinds of bees and specialist bees. And then down below is my beloved Maximilian sunflower. Now it's a leggy plant. It's going to be a tall plant and it's going to fall over because, as you can see, it's covered with flowers. That's why I love it. It's covered at every leaf axil. So these flowers climb up this tall thing and then they're too heavy and they fall over. So I always just arrange for those flowers to fall either on my asparagus after they're done, I'm done eating them. I let them go to fern, and then these can lay on top of those asparagus, or I let them fall across. I have that false bamboo growing in one part of my front garden, and I will lay those branches right across that bamboo. And I don't care what happens to the bamboo, but I love those sunflowers. I want you to pay attention to the trees. I have been planting lots of prunus. I told you my little cherry tree is a prunus species. I planted 3 wild American plums last year, and all 3 died. I'm watching them, and none of them is sending up a sprout yet. It breaks my heart. And cottonwoods support 367 species of moth or butterfly caterpillar. But look at the oak. That's Quercus. If you can only plant 1 tree, plant an oak. They have them in many sizes, but look at how many moths and caterpillar they support. Moths and butterfly caterpillar. These are the trees that support the food. These support the food web. All the native animals, the little tiny animals that can't get nutrition out of leaves, that the leaves got out of the sunshine, they can get nutrition out of the fats and proteins of a caterpillar. So you want to grow caterpillars on these plants. Notice that the willow, it actually supports 455 species of caterpillar. And let's see, look at the maple, 247. The birch, that'd be your old river birch, 411. So you pick a tree that is going to grow the most food for the food web, or a shrub. And then you also pick plants that will save a species, like a specialist bee. Oh, and this one says, what are you going to do? You're going to have to make decisions. And to do that, you need to be educated and knowledgeable about bees and all the insects. Because I don't know if I've said it yet, but I think you know. If you garden for the specialist bees, you will get all the bees. You will get all the beneficial insects, and that includes the predators as well as the butterflies, as well as the ones that clean up stuff. Clean up the dead stuff. So, but what you'll start doing is please observe the bees. You could join well, not a million, but there are citizen scientists, and some of them are nuts about bees. They simply will, for 5 minutes a day, go out and observe one particular sunflower because they've joined a group that are counting the bees on a sunflower during specific 5-minute periods. And they'd send that data into a gathering house. So you could be a citizen scientist with your bee observations. But the other thing is you do have to be able to, you're going to get all the insects. So you have to make the decision. Do I want that one? What is that one doing on these leaves? Can I tolerate that leaf damage? And my thought is, look at that creature on the left part of the slide. Do I even want that in my yard? It looks like some kind of killer, poisonous something. Nope, it's a Gulf fritillary larva, and it eats the passion vine leaf. And in the above picture, you've got a passion vine flower and you've got a Gulf fritillary. Well, I want a Gulf fritillary, so I'm trying to grow passion vines. I still haven't been successful there. All right, now what then is the role for the backyard gardener now? What the entomologists are asking me to say to you, and what I really personally would ask you, is that you would be not just gardening for your own personal needs and your own personal gratification, although you will have gratification out of your flowers or you wouldn't be doing it at all. Think of yourself as growing bees, not just plants, growing insects, not just plants. And then also try to constantly add native plants. That's what you won't find very many at the box stores, but every now and then there will be native plants in some of the local greenhouses. And I'm not supposed to advertise anybody, but I love the Dick Arboretum. And sometimes each year they sell, as a fundraiser, they sell the native plants and their volunteers pot up native plants. I go there like it's a religious festival because they have lots of different kinds of native plants. And here's my iris bed in which I saw my little teeny tiny black and white bee. And since then I've read more about that. They said some of these pithy woody stems that the 30% that are wood nesters need, the little tiny black and white bee can't actually make that first opening into the iris stem or into the other stem, like even an echinacea stem. So they're suggesting when I clean up our gardens, what we might do is just not get rid of the stem, but bend it, 18 to 20 inches above the ground. You might be able to get it. It's less unsightly, but what you've really done is you've created a place where a native bee might be able to dig in and create a nest. You're going to help her. And now what else can you do? You've got to be knowledgeable about plants and you've got to avoid pesticides. Besides those things, there are 5 guidelines that will help you create the structural habitat you need for this complicated garden. I want you to plant densely, more flowers than you've ever planted at any time in your life. I want you to seek differences, different plants. One way you can do that is that you buy plants that are going to grow leaves in different layers. You're going to grow layers of leaves. You might have an understory tree and a shrub, and then maybe a flowering perennial, and then maybe a ground cover. But what you're trying to do is create a sort of 3-dimensional world of leaves that's going to create wonderful habitat for those small animals. And then there's another thing that the ecologists call edge. These are, imagine that your lawn could be cut into pieces of pie. And so each of these horizontal divisions, you might, for example, in one piece of the pie have a pond, and in the next piece of pie, you might have a hedgerow. Well, those are 2 different habitats. And when they come together, the pond is on the edge of the hedgerow. What you've created is really complex habitat where a lot of action occurs. And then you'll need to provide water. Okay, here are these guidelines. But first of all, the picture on the right shows you is another picture of my butterfly garden. This is in the fall. Oh, no, it isn't, because I've got yarrow blooming, and that's my spring yarrow. I've got Verbena bonariensis, an exotic annual that just reseeds itself, causes no trouble, and just grows up through other plants and is kind of pretty. And then I've got Campion rose. A master gardener gave me some seeds a decade ago, and it just keeps reseeding. I never know where it's going to be, and I don't really know if any insects use it. I've never actually seen insects on it, but it doesn't hurt anything and it's not invasive. Now, the word density means plant more of everything. Remember that 4 square foot swath? I can't tell you how hard I worked on this. This is my front raised bed. I have never had a swath of flowers. I've got for myself a swath of echinacea there. Those cone flowers, I planted them from seed. I bought them. I bought them on sale. I bought them when they weren't on sale. I wanted a swath. And then back in the back, you can see I've got Rudbeckia. I've got almost a swath of Rudbeckia. So that's the kind of flowers, density of flowers that you want to think about producing. And I understand that some of you might be starting smaller than that, but don't forget lots of flowers. Now, when you have lots of flowers like that, think efficiency. I told you what that mason bee's life is like. Honeybees are loyal. That the hive, they'll just go and they kind of talk to each other and they found a good, for example, these are all flocks or almost all flocks. And they might just find that the purple ones are producing better pollen. They're maybe more conducive now to harvesting the pollen. And so all the bees in that hive will decide to stick to the purple. And I've had gardeners tell me, yeah, they're eating my blue salvia, but they're not even touching the white or the red. And so bees will be loyal to a species, but what I'm more caring about is that native bee. You have these flowers in huge numbers close together, and that little mason bee can just cross from one flower to the next. Those little bees can just get nectar all hours, and they don't have to fly far. And when they get all that pollen, and then they go quickly back to their little tunnel nest. This I've included because I love that New England aster, and I wanted to show you the top flower I caught, the migrating monarchs on the way back south. They're 1,000 miles from Mexico still, but they are big animals. These migrators, they've been packing on pounds since they hatched. The caterpillar eats more leaves than any other of the monarch caterpillars. They create these huge butterflies who do not mate, who do not develop reproductive organs until the following spring when they decide to migrate north. These guys are migrating south, and I've got several shrubs of this New England aster that I find them on because it's blooming at the end of October. Not because it's the prettiest shrub, but because they need that food then. They're in Kansas then, and Kansas is important to them at that time. All right, diversity. This is, again, I was kind of planting natives in groups of one. I'm getting better, but that's the giant beard tongue. I think that was a penstem, and I think it was the dark-leaved one, but it changed. So I don't know. Behind that is a big solidago. And then to the left is a young oak leaf hydrangea. And that's a lot of different kinds of stems and leaves and flowers and flowering times. That's what you want. Plus, I've got Virginia creeper climbing an elm tree. So I've got a lot of different things going on there. This is my solidago, and I want you to see its particular structure right next to those yucca blades. They're first of all pretty, but second of all, there are different kinds of habitat because of what each flower brings to the table. And the continuous blooms, the yucca only produces that big, that single flower or single flowers. But what you want are all different kinds of blooms so that you'll have lots of nectar and pollen throughout the season. Some of the flowers you choose will actually produce berries and seeds to carry over into the winter to feed birds and other insects. There are continuous leaves that are available for the insects to eat, the caterpillars. And then there's continuous cover. Look how dense that cover is. For the eggs that a monarch lays, well, she's not laying on either of those two plants, but for the larvae and the young bees or wasps or whatever. Now, to get diversity, landscape problems are actually not problems, they're opportunities. For example, a rain garden is actually a buffer strip to capture rainwater, control erosion. And what's more, you already had that wet soil, say by the driveway. Don't haul in good soil, use what you've got and use those wet soils and find the native plants that need their feet wet or tolerate wet feet. And you have different species, different leaves, different flowering times, and you didn't have to do anything. You just used your wet ground. Another one would be if you have permanent boundaries to make some kind of hedgerow. Hedgerows, because they can be layered, they can be wildflowers in front of a shrub, are pretty complicated. All right, here we are back to vertical layers. There is my tree island. You can see my cherry tree has grown a bit, and it's got the aster, and it also has this tiger leaf. I knew it just an hour ago. I knew that, but it's that lovely thing I've always wanted. One of you knows that. I've reduced lawn, I've made a tree island, I've added native plants, and I've created layers of leaves and branches and complex intermingled structure. And you can see that best when you see the fall color. Those leaves are twining, those branches are sticking into each other, and they are creating a form of cover that is really good for the animals. Tiger sumac. Tiger eye sumac. Now, and when you're doing these vertical structure, there's my tree island. You can see it's much smaller. In Kansas, you've got a canopy tree, probably somewhere, an understory tree. Those are almost always in flower, and they would be wonderful resources for flowers. Shrubs and herbaceous plants like my aster, which actually can be kind of shrubby if you grow it outright, and ground cover, the Virginia creeper. This is what you're trying to emulate. You're reducing lawn and you're increasing native plants, and you're creating complexity in your habitat. And one thing I want you to think about is that complex weaving of branches that we're getting when we have diverse species. Here we have a pecan tree. It's an outstanding tree. It supports 200 species of butterfly and moth. But look at it, it's isolated on this place. Any insect or bird trying to fly there has become prey. Any insect or bird trying to leave that tree is prey. That's not how we want our garden to be. So you want your canopy tree, you want something snuggled up under its trunk so that the insects and things that are in it have a way to get down to the ground and maybe to the ground cover, maybe to the flowers. Number one, to forage in the flowers. But number two, they won't be picked off by the predators. So your garden should have layers of trees to provide all the shelter that these animals need. And then there's edge. Now, this is an edge I created after a flood. And what it is I'd never raised bed vegetable garden. I had never had a vegetable garden. I told you I'm not very disciplined. This is my vegetable garden. And I was able to create in that raised bed. It's about 2.5 feet by 20 feet, something like that, because I had to divert rainwater if it ever rained again 9 inches in 4 hours. I had to divert that rainwater from going in my front door so that it would go follow that rocky path down to our pond. Well, what I did was create some edges. I've got stone path on those big pebbles. All of that is a different habitat than the soil in that garden. And behind that is grass, which does have moles in it. So that's a habitat for moles. I'm not proud of that. But I've created an edge there. And there's unmanicured lawn. I've got a dying cottonwood back there, which completed its dying. I had those borers. And then and behind that, I've got a cedar tree hedge. Now, this is Cindy McWilliams' garden. I don't know if she still has this pond, but I was so stunned. It was perfect. A pond is, by its very nature, water is a different habitat. But look what she did. She dug a hole in her lawn, creating the pond, which is different habitat. She stacked that dirt behind the pond to create this attractive arrangement of stacked rocks. The mound behind the pond is different, and then the stacked rocks is different habitat. And then around that, she's got flowering plants and she's got shrubby edges. She's got the lawn where nothing really can live. And then she's got trees. So what you want to do is that think of this as many options. There are a lot of predators in there who are catching their kids' lunch. There are a lot of prey. There is a lot of prey in there, and they're dodging the predators because there's so many places to hide and to sneak around. And then you've got to provide water. And it could be that rain garden. It could be a bird bath. I didn't even know we had, I knew bluebirds, the North American bluebird lived in Kansas. I knew that. But I didn't know that it was like this. I put in a heater in this old broken, bird bath. And within days, I had a flock of North American bluebirds on that. They needed water more than they've ever needed food at my feeders. And that's being true this year. I have cedar waxwings. Now, I've often in the spring had cedar waxwings, but this spring, has been odd. We have those 70-degree days and a cold night. And I have been coming out and noticing that my bird baths are empty. They are bone dry. I think, did the raccoon drink all that water? So I fill up my bird baths and then I come back in and 3 hours later, they're empty again. And finally, I found it. I looked out and cedar waxwings by the dozens were drinking the water in my little bird baths. And then last night, I actually tried to count them. I've never seen, it was about 60 to 70 cedar waxwings in the top of my cottonwoods. Well, remember that the bees will need a very dry place to get to water. So see the gravel in this puddle that a butterfly might use? None of them can get wet. Think of those teeny tiny bees. They're a half an inch. They're smaller than a half an inch. A raindrop will kill them. So you need a wind protected sunny spot. You need it could be even marbles, and the water is always under the level of marbles, so the bee can get to it, but isn't killed by it. Now, if you've got those 5 guidelines under your belt, you have created complex habitat, and there you have it. We have another bee assassin, this time on an echinacea, sitting there waiting to kill a bee, but we're not worried about it now because we know that's his job. And we know that he can live here because we have lots of bees, because we've created complex habitat. Now, if you build this habitat, they will come. This is my butterfly garden. That would have been last fall. I have lots and lots of, those are actually native sunflowers, nothing special about those, but that they grow and they have lots of flowers. And once they're in there, you might as well keep them. And then I have Mexican sunflower. And up here in the left is that little yellow one. Well, it's not little, but it has that pale yellow. I think it's called lemony lace. That's one the citizen scientists use. They'll have you go out and observe the pollinators on that flower for a 15-minute period and send the records into them several times. Citizen science about these insects in our gardens is very entertaining, and it's a very big deal. And they have government sites that will tell you how to do it. And you can pick the science you're interested in, and you think, I think I will count butterflies on sunflowers. Now, if you build that habitat, you're not just going to save the specialist bees, you're going to save all the bees. You're not going to just save the bees, you're going to save all the pollinators. And that includes, that's one of the beneficials. You're going to save those predators like that pesky bee assassin, and you're going to save the parasitoids, which I haven't even talked to you about and which I love, but they're very scary. And then the decomposers. Now the neutrals you will also save, but you won't see them. Most of the population of insects are neutrals. They're hiding in those pebbles in my little river pathway there. They're hiding under the rocks. They're out in the tops of those trees. They never want to encounter a human being. That is the last thing they want. And we don't want to encounter them. I actually found a beautiful decomposer by accident. He was drowning in my dog's water bowl. They live under rocks, and I would have never guessed it's a male rainbow beetle. And he's a decomposer, and skin is iridescent, and he had a horn beetle. I didn't know we had those. I didn't know we had them in Kansas. I sure didn't know we had it in my yard because his path never crosses mine. And here we do have a pest. I don't know if you can see it on the slide. A spotted cucumber beetle. I took this picture because he's alive. I only see the spotted and the striped cucumber beetles when they're in the mouths of a wasp. I have lots of pictures of wasps killing them. And by the way, pests, only 2 to 5% of all insects are pests. And those are animals that hurt our crops, carry disease, sting us, take a little bit of our blood. Now we can create and support habitat for these bees if we remember to do everything I've talked to you about. You know, you're going to be a very knowledgeable gardener. You're going to do research if you have to. You're going to know about the insects. You're going to try to find about which plants are going to be the best plants for the insects in your garden. You're going to find the right plant and put it in the right place so you don't waste your money and your time trying to grow a shade plant in the sun. And the best plants would be the ones that either grow the most for the food web or save an animal from extinction and possibly its plant from extinction. Now you're going to find keystone plants, and you won't have many people helping you at first. The National Wildlife Federation has got a website in which they have actually made lists for us and lists of things to look for in our ecoregion because the information is so new, nobody knows it, including, you know, the very best gardeners. I was delighted to see that the word specialist bees is now in the vocabulary in some of the articles I've been reading, and it wasn't 2 years ago, it just wasn't there. Now, you're going to design your garden so that it's densely planted and has many, many different species. And to get those species different, you're going to have vertical layers and you're going to have horizontal differences called edges. And you're going to have water, and you are absolutely going to avoid the use of pesticides. And here are my references. And I know I'm continuing to talk, but I have to show you this picture. That, first of all, is a common milkweed flower. And last summer, I have a lot of common milkweed plants. They are actually a swath in that butterfly garden. And when they are in bloom, they're about 5 feet tall. And they have these giant pink flowers, but they fill the air with the finest perfume. I have never had a garden smell so lovely. My sons, who are both in their 50s now, were visiting me, and they were out in that garden because it was beautiful. And they were taking pictures of different things. When I saw this, I was about 6 or 7 feet away, and I asked them to come over, and I said, do you see that? And they didn't, they just saw flowers. And I said, well, look at that one flower. Do you see, there is a honeybee hanging from that flower. And I said, if you go in there closely, that is a honeybee being killed by a predator. And my son had this great camera. And if you look really closely, you can see that pale, creamy colored crab spider holding on to that honeybee while he sucks its life juices. But that's the jungle, and that's nature. And it's not harmonious, but it is complex and it is balanced. All right. Any questions?
Okay, thank you so much, Denise. Your presentation has been fabulous, and we have all appreciated your enthusiasm. We've had a couple of questions that have been posted in the chat. The first one is, and I apologize if I mispronounce this, is Tithonia, Mexican sunflower, a keystone species as well?
They're only talking about the keystones in the United States, and it probably is not yet called one. It actually isn't even really a sunflower. It's not the Helianthus species or genus. It has to be the sunflower genus, and Tithonia isn't. But it's got nectar. It's got a flat platform, and it's pretty.
Okay. And then another question is, the summer sun is so hot. Should the butterfly petals be in the full sun?
They must have sun. But it will cause your water to evaporate quickly. You will have to watch that. If you make that little puddle, you will have to watch it constantly. And you can have some shade, but the puddle should be in sunlight, or the insects can't operate without heat. Now, in the heat of summer, you might want to give it probably could be shaded part of the day, because Kansas will take care of the warmth. But like in the spring and in the fall, you might want to move that puddle back to a place that's full sun.
So that actually concludes this evening's program. I just want to again thank Denise for your incredibly informative, enthusiastic program. You did an absolutely fabulous job, and just thank everyone for coming.
Thanks very much.
You're welcome. And that concludes tonight's
appreciate my
program.
audience. It's
Say
nice
that-
having people interested.
Yes, it is wonderful to have people's interests. Okay, so that concludes tonight's program. Thank you, everybody.